The billionaire CEO looked me in the eye, in front of my 10-year-old daughter, tore my $199 invoice in half, and told me that men like me were always looking for ways to exploit rich people. Her executives laughed. A few customers laughed, too. Standing there in my grease-stained work shirt while my daughter pretended not to cry behind the front counter, I honestly believed losing that money was the worst thing that was going to happen to us. I was wrong. Less than 24 hours later, that same woman's dying father would arrive at my front door carrying a $19 million check and a secret my late wife had hidden from me for years. A secret so cruel it had stolen 8 years from a father and daughter, allowed a powerful man to destroy an entire family from the inside, and left an old man dying while believing his own child no longer loved him. My name is Jake Carter. I'm a single dad, and this is the story of how a $199 invoice uncovered the cruelest lie I have ever seen. The ending of this story changed everything. Before we get there, take a quick second to join the community by hitting subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The day Sophia Hart's Mustang rolled into my garage, I was underneath a '67 Camaro trying to convince myself that the foreclosure notice folded inside my toolbox wasn't real. My 10-year-old daughter, Emma, was doing homework at the front counter when she looked out the window and said, "Dad, I think somebody rich is having a really bad day." I slid out from under the Camaro and saw a dark blue 1968 Mustang convertible sitting crooked at the edge of the parking lot. A woman in an expensive gray suit stood beside it, talking sharply into her phone. Even from 30 feet away, you could tell she was used to people fixing problems immediately. "No, cancel the meeting," she snapped. "If I don't make it back to headquarters in the next 2 hours, the entire acquisition falls apart." I walked over, introduced myself, and took a quick look under the hood. The fuel delivery system had failed. It wasn't a complicated repair, but the parts weren't something I'd normally keep in stock. When I explained that, she barely looked at me. "I need this car by 8 tomorrow morning," she said, "whatever it costs." Then she handed her assistant a black card and walked away to continue her call. Emma whispered, "She didn't even ask your name." Around midnight, after driving across Charleston to track down the part, I finally got the Mustang running. I could have waited until morning, but something about the desperation in that woman's voice stayed with me. Maybe it was because desperation recognizes desperation. My own business was weeks from collapse, and I knew what it felt like when everything depended on one thing going right. At exactly 7:50 the next morning, 3 black SUVs pulled into my lot. Sophia Hart stepped out surrounded by executives, assistants, and people carrying tablets. I recognized her immediately from business magazines stacked in waiting rooms all over Charleston. Billionaire CEO Hart Global, one of the most powerful women in South Carolina. I handed her the keys and the invoice, $199. She looked at it for less than 2 seconds. "What's this?" she asked. I thought she was joking. "Your bill," I said. "Parts, labor, after-hours service." Sophia looked at her executives, then back at me. "I never authorized repairs." I reminded her she'd said, "whatever it costs." She folded the invoice and handed it back. "You saw an expensive car, assumed I was wealthy, and decided to take advantage of the situation." Several executives laughed quietly. Customers inside the garage stopped talking. Emma froze behind the counter. I told Sophia I had spent half the night fixing her car because she said an important business deal depended on it. "That's your choice," she replied coldly. "You're not getting a penny." One executive actually pulled out his phone and started recording. For a second, I considered arguing. God knows I needed the money. Instead, I looked over at Emma. She was watching everything. So I took the invoice, tore it in half, dropped the pieces into the trash, and said, "Then I guess we're done here." Sophia stared at me for a moment as if she hadn't expected that answer. Then she turned, climbed into the Mustang, and drove away. I spent the rest of the day pretending none of it bothered me. The next morning, while Emma and I were eating cereal before school, a long black limousine stopped in front of our house. I opened the front door expecting to see a bill collector. At that point in my life, bill collectors showed up a lot more often than limousines. Instead, I found an elderly man standing beside the long black car parked in front of my house. He looked to be in his early 70s, dressed simply in khakis and a navy sweater, nothing like the executives I'd seen the day before. There wasn't a driver opening doors for him or assistants carrying tablets. He was standing there alone, hands folded in front of him, studying the faded paint on my porch like it reminded him of something. Emma peeked around my leg and whispered, "Dad, rich people don't usually come to our neighborhood." The man smiled. "No," he said softly. "I suppose we don't." Then he extended his hand. "Jake Carter? My name is Daniel Hart." For a second, I genuinely thought he was joking. Daniel Hart was practically royalty in South Carolina. Hart Global employed nearly 20,000 people. Schools, hospital wings, and university buildings carried his name. Yet there he was, standing on my porch at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Before I could say anything, he glanced toward Emma and asked, "May I come in? I owe your father an apology." 10 minutes later, Daniel Hart was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee from a mug Emma had painted in 3rd grade. He apologized immediately. "Sophia had no right to treat you the way she did," he said. "Whatever disagreements my daughter and I may have, I didn't raise her to humiliate working people." I told him it wasn't necessary. People with money had been looking down on mechanics my entire career. Daniel looked genuinely saddened by that. "That doesn't make it acceptable," he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed an envelope on the table. I expected cash, maybe a check for the repair bill and an awkward handshake. Instead, when I opened the envelope, I nearly dropped it. The check was made out to me for $19 million. I honestly thought there had to be a mistake. I checked the number 3 times. $19 million. Enough money to save my business, pay off my house, send Emma to any school she wanted, and still never work another day in my life. "I can't accept this," I said immediately, sliding it back across the table. Daniel didn't touch it. "Yes, you can." I shook my head. "No, I can't. I fixed a car. I don't take charity." Daniel's expression changed at the word charity. "This isn't charity, Jake." He looked down at the kitchen table for several seconds before continuing. "Your wife once saved my life. I never repaid her." I stared at him, convinced I'd misheard. "Claire?" I asked. "My Claire?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Years ago." The room suddenly felt smaller. Claire had been gone for almost 4 years. Cancer takes many things from a family, but one of the cruelest is that eventually you stop learning new things about the person you lost. Or at least, I thought you did. Claire never mentioned Daniel Hart. Not once. Not during treatments. Not during those long nights in hospital rooms when sleep became optional and honesty became unavoidable. Emma looked back and forth between us. "Mom knew you?" she asked. Daniel smiled sadly. "Very well." I asked him how. Daniel looked toward the window. "That's a much longer story." Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, Daniel turned back toward me. There was something in his face I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. Regret. "Jake," he said quietly, "there are things your wife never wanted you to know." Then he climbed into the limousine and drove away, leaving a $19 million check on my kitchen table and a question that immediately made me wonder how well I had really known my own wife. After Daniel left my house, I spent the entire day distracted. I burned through 3 cups of coffee at the garage, nearly installed the wrong alternator in a customer's truck, and snapped at Emma when she asked if billionaires always carried checks that large. By closing time, I knew I wasn't sleeping until I got answers. That night, after Emma went to bed, I climbed into the attic and pulled down the plastic storage bins containing Claire's things. Most widowers have boxes like that. You tell yourself you'll go through them someday, but someday keeps moving. Around midnight, sitting on the living room floor surrounded by old photographs, hospital bracelets, and notebooks, I found a small wooden box I had never seen before. Inside were dozens of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every envelope carried the same return address, Daniel Hart. My heart started pounding. There weren't just a few letters. There were years' worth. Some had been exchanged during the exact months Claire was undergoing chemotherapy. Several included photographs of Claire and Daniel sitting together in hospital gardens, drinking coffee, smiling. One letter from Daniel thanked Claire for refusing to let me give up. Another mentioned their weekly meetings during treatment. Then I found something written in Claire's handwriting. Please don't tell Jake yet. He already has enough to carry. I read that line over and over. Claire had shared everything with me, or at least I had always believed she had. Yet somehow, during the hardest years of our marriage, she had been meeting one of the richest men in America in secret. Sitting there in the silence of our living room, surrounded by memories of the woman I loved more than anyone, I felt something ugly rise inside me. For the first time since her death, I wondered what else she had hidden. The next morning I drove to Hart Global, carrying the letters in a folder. I needed answers, and Daniel was the only person who could give them. I barely reached the executive floor before Sophia Hart appeared. Someone had clearly told her I was there. She looked at the folder in my hands and immediately assumed the worst. I should have known, she said loudly. First the check, now this. How much are you planning to take from my father? Employees slowed to watch. I told her I wasn't there about money. Of course not, she said coldly. You're just spending time with a lonely, dying billionaire out of the goodness of your heart. I felt every eye in the hallway on me. Your father knew my wife, I said. I'm looking for answers. Sophia's expression hardened. My father is sick, vulnerable, and surrounded by opportunists. You're manipulating a dying old man, and I won't let it continue. Before I could respond, Daniel stepped out of his office. That's enough, Sophia, he said. She turned on him immediately. No, Dad, he's using you. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but suddenly stopped. One hand grabbed his chest. The color drained from his face, and seconds later he collapsed onto the floor right in front of us. Daniel survived. That was the first thing the doctor told us after nearly 40 minutes of waiting outside the cardiac unit at Charleston Memorial Hospital. It wasn't a heart attack, the doctor explained. Severe exhaustion combined with an underlying condition. Sophia looked relieved for exactly 3 seconds before she turned toward me. You need to leave, she said quietly. My father doesn't need this right now. I almost argued, but I was too exhausted. More importantly, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had shown up demanding answers, and minutes later her father had collapsed. So I left. But I took Claire's letters with me, and over the next few days I became obsessed with understanding how my wife and Daniel Hart had known each other. Most of Claire's medical records were still stored in boxes inside my office. I spent hours going through insurance forms, appointment schedules, and treatment summaries. Late on the second night, I found something strange. Buried inside her oncology paperwork was a volunteer identification badge issued by Charleston Children's Hospital. Claire had never mentioned volunteering, not once. The badge gave me a date range, nearly 18 months. The next morning, I drove to the hospital. A retired nurse named Susan Keller still remembered Claire immediately. The moment I showed her Claire's photograph, her face softened. Your wife practically lived here, she said. Even during chemotherapy, she spent every Thursday with the children. I honestly thought she had confused Claire with someone else. Susan shook her head. No, Claire refused to miss a week. She eventually led me to the pediatric oncology wing. A plaque near the entrance caught my attention immediately. The Hart Children's Hope Program, anonymous founder. Susan noticed me staring. Mr. Hart funded the entire program, she said. He and Claire became very close. Suddenly, pieces started falling into place. The letters, the photographs, the meetings. Claire and Daniel hadn't been having some secret affair. They had become friends while both were spending time around seriously ill children. Susan smiled sadly. Those two used to sit in the garden for hours talking. Before I left, she handed me a sealed envelope she'd found among old volunteer records years earlier. Claire's handwriting covered the front. For Daniel, if anything happens to me. Inside was a short letter. Most of it was deeply personal, but one sentence stopped me cold. Promise me Emma will never grow up alone. Daniel had signed the bottom. I promise. There was nothing else, no explanation, no details, just a promise. Later that evening, Sophia unexpectedly arrived at my garage. I showed her the letter. For the first time since we'd met, she looked genuinely shaken. Why would my father promise something like this? She asked. Before I could answer, Daniel himself walked in. Sophia immediately confronted him. Dad, what did Claire ask you to do? Daniel looked at the letter, then at both of us. I'm not ready to talk about that yet, he said quietly. Sophia stared at him in disbelief. You've hidden enough already. Daniel simply shook his head. Some promises aren't mine to break. Over the next week, Daniel Hart became a regular presence in my life. He stopped by the garage several times, usually bringing donuts for Emma and coffee for me. He never mentioned the promise he'd made to Claire, and I eventually stopped asking. What surprised me was Emma. She took to Daniel almost immediately. Maybe it was because Daniel listened the way older people sometimes do, as if a 10-year-old's thoughts deserved the same attention as everyone else's. One afternoon I walked into the office and found the two of them sitting on overturned toolboxes drawing superheroes. Emma was explaining why capes were impractical during combat, and Daniel was taking the discussion very seriously. Watching them together felt strangely familiar. It also made me realize how much Emma had missed having an older figure in her life since losing Claire. Sophia noticed it too, and she clearly didn't like it. A few days later, while Daniel was helping Emma sand an old bicycle frame behind the garage, Sophia unexpectedly arrived. She stood there watching them for several seconds before saying quietly, I haven't seen him smile like that in years. It was the first honest thing she'd said to me. We ended up talking while Emma and Daniel worked. That's when Sophia finally told me the truth. She and Daniel had barely spoken in 8 years. According to Sophia, when her mother was dying from ovarian cancer, Daniel had buried himself in Hart Global instead of being with his family. My mother spent her final weeks asking for him, Sophia said. Most of the time he wasn't there. I looked over at Daniel. He had heard every word. He never denied it. He never defended himself. He simply kept helping Emma tighten the bicycle chain. That silence disturbed me more than any argument could have. Either Sophia was telling the truth, or Daniel believed he deserved the blame. As Sophia prepared to leave, she looked at Emma laughing beside her father and said, Be careful. He's very good at disappointing people. After she drove away, Daniel sat quietly in the garage for several minutes. Finally, he looked at me and said, Jake, if something happens to me, promise you'll look after Sophia. I stared at him. After everything she said? Daniel nodded slowly. Especially after everything she said. Daniel's request stayed with me. Protect Sophia. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Sophia barely tolerated her father, and Daniel seemed willing to accept every accusation she threw at him without defending himself. It felt wrong. A man who had spent weeks visiting children's cancer wards with my wife didn't strike me as someone who would simply abandon his own dying spouse. The more I replayed Sophia's story, the more inconsistencies I noticed. One afternoon, while Daniel and Emma were working on an old go-kart behind the garage, I asked Daniel directly why he hadn't been with his wife during her final weeks. He looked down at the wrench in his hand and said quietly, I was there every day. Before I could ask anything else, he changed the subject. That answer bothered me enough that I started making calls. Through one of my customers, I was put in touch with Frank Miller, a retired Hart Global executive who had worked closely with Daniel for nearly 30 years. When I mentioned Sophia, Frank went silent. Then he said, "If you're trying to understand what happened between those two, start with Victor Sloan." According to Frank, Victor had controlled nearly every aspect of Daniel's schedule and personal communications during Sophia's mother's illness. Daniel trusted him completely, Frank told me. Too completely. Over the next several days, more former employees agreed to speak privately. The stories were disturbingly similar. Victor had screened phone calls, managed correspondence, and personally handled communication between Daniel and his family during that period. Then Frank showed me something that changed everything. Copies of letters Sophia had written to her father while her mother was dying. None had ever been delivered. Instead, they had been archived by Victor's office. Several contained desperate messages begging Daniel to come home. At almost the same time, Daniel discovered a locked file box among old company records. Inside were dozens of letters he had written to Sophia over the years, letters she had never received. One letter, written 8 years earlier, simply said, "Please, let me explain. I never stopped loving you." Sophia read it in complete silence. Then she found something even worse. Internal memos revealed that Victor had repeatedly told her that Daniel had emotionally moved on and was secretly building another family after her mother's death. Meanwhile, Victor had convinced Daniel that Sophia blamed him for her mother's death and wanted nothing more to do with him. 8 years, 8 birthdays, 8 Christmases, 8 years of grief, anger, and silence built entirely on lies. Sophia looked at her father across the room, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you abandoned us," she whispered. Daniel's voice broke when he answered, "I thought you hated me." In that moment, both of them realized they hadn't lost 8 years. They had been robbed of them. Everything fell apart 3 days after Sophia and Daniel finally learned the truth. I was replacing brake lines on a customer's truck when reporters started showing up outside my garage. At first, I thought it had something to do with Hart Global's internal problems. Then one of them shouted, "Mr. Carter, how long have you been manipulating Daniel Hart?" I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country seemed to be running the same story. According to anonymous sources inside Hart Global, I was a struggling mechanic who had deliberately targeted a sick billionaire for financial gain. Commentators on television called me a con artist. Social media was even worse. Complete strangers dissected my life online. They posted photographs of my house, my garage, even pictures of Emma taken from school events. Someone dug up the foreclosure notice filed against my business and used it as proof that I'd pursued Daniel for money. By that evening, my garage phone wouldn't stop ringing. Half the calls came from reporters. The other half came from customers canceling appointments. I didn't need proof that Victor Sloan was behind it. The timing alone made it obvious. The attack didn't stop with me. 2 days later, Emma came home from school unusually quiet. She barely touched dinner. Eventually, I asked what was wrong. She stared down at her plate and said, "Maddie's mom told her not to come to my birthday party because she thinks we're stealing from old people." I didn't know what to say. No parent is prepared for that conversation. The next morning, things got worse. Sophia held a press conference outside Hart Global headquarters. I watched it live from the garage office. She looked exhausted. "Mr. Carter has no formal relationship with Hart Global," she told reporters. "Any personal interactions between my father and Mr. Carter are private matters." Legally, it was exactly what she needed to say to protect the company. Emotionally, it felt like a knife. She never called beforehand. She never warned me. Watching her distance herself publicly after everything we'd uncovered together hurt far more than I expected. That night, Emma found me sitting alone in the garage long after closing. She sat beside me on the workbench and asked quietly, "Dad, did Mom know rich people could be this cruel?" I looked around at the empty garage, the canceled work orders, and the stack of unpaid bills sitting on my desk. Then I looked at my daughter. Losing Claire had nearly destroyed us once. I wasn't going to let this destroy Emma, too. The next morning, I called Daniel and told him I was ending all contact with the Hart family. For everyone's sake, I was walking away forever. I meant it when I told Daniel I was walking away. For almost a week, I ignored every phone call from him and Sophia. I focused on the garage, what little business remained, and Emma. Then, late one Friday afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. The past few weeks had clearly taken a toll on him. He didn't ask to come inside. Instead, he handed me a small cardboard box. "I found this while going through some old files," he said quietly. "I think it belongs to Emma." Before I could ask what he meant, he added, "I'm sorry, Jake. I should have found it years ago." Then he left. Inside the box were several photographs, a hospital volunteer badge, and an old flash drive labeled in Claire's handwriting, "For Emma, after I'm gone." My knees almost gave out. Emma had already come downstairs by the time I managed to plug the drive into my laptop. The video opened immediately. Claire appeared on the screen wearing a hospital gown, thinner than I remembered, but still unmistakably Claire. Emma burst into tears the second she saw her mother's face. I couldn't breathe. Claire smiled gently into the camera. "Hi, baby girl," she said. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't get to stay as long as I wanted." Emma climbed into my lap, clutching my shirt with both hands. Halfway through the recording, Claire said something that changed everything. "Daniel, if you're watching this before Emma, thank you for keeping your promise." I paused the video immediately. Daniel had known about this message all along. Worse, he had apparently been responsible for delivering it. Furious, I drove straight to the Hart estate. Daniel looked genuinely confused when I confronted him. He swore he'd never seen the flash drive before. Within hours, Daniel's longtime assistant uncovered internal records showing the drive had been logged into Hart Global's private archives nearly 4 years earlier. The person who signed it into storage was Victor Sloan. Security footage confirmed it. Victor had deliberately hidden Claire's final message. Nobody knew why. All we knew was that Emma had lost 4 years with her mother's last words, because someone had decided to bury them. That night, all of us, me, Emma, Daniel, and eventually even Sophia, sat together in Daniel's living room and watched the entire video. Near the end, Claire looked directly into the camera and said, "Emma, if anything happens to me, trust Daniel. He'll protect you when your father can't carry everything alone." Then she turned toward someone standing behind the camera. "And Daniel, if Jake ever learns the truth, promise me you'll help him forgive me." The room went completely silent. Sophia stared at her father in disbelief. I sat there wondering how my wife had trusted Daniel Hart enough to place our daughter's future in his hands while never telling me any of it. Emma was crying openly. Sophia was crying too. Daniel simply lowered his head into his hands. By the end of the night, every person in that room had lost something. The only difference was that some of us were just finding out what it was. Daniel began declining almost immediately after we watched Claire's video. The man who had spent weeks showing Emma how to rebuild bicycle chains and telling terrible jokes in my garage suddenly looked fragile. He grew thinner. His visits became shorter. Some days, he sounded exhausted after walking across a room. Still, he refused to talk about his health. "I'm 72, Jake," he would say with a smile. "At my age, everything hurts." Then, 3 weeks after Claire's video surfaced, I received a call from Daniel's housekeeper at 6:30 in the morning. Daniel had collapsed during the night and had been rushed to Charleston Memorial Hospital. By the time I arrived, Sophia was nowhere to be found. Nobody had been able to reach her. The doctors weren't optimistic. Daniel had developed severe complications, and the attending physician quietly suggested that immediate family should prepare themselves. I called Sophia repeatedly. No answer. Nearly 4 hours later, she finally returned my call from an airport in Seattle. The moment she heard the words critical condition, she stopped speaking. Then she whispered, "Tell him I'm coming." She landed in Charleston just after midnight and drove straight to the hospital, barely slowing down long enough to sign visitor paperwork. I had never seen anyone look so terrified. Sophia practically ran through the intensive care unit. Before entering Daniel's room, she stopped one of the nurses and asked the question none of us wanted answered. "Is he conscious?" The nurse nodded. "Barely." Then she added something none of us expected. "Mr. Hart has refused stronger pain medication for the past 3 days." Sophia looked confused. "Why?" The nurse smiled sadly. "He said he needed to stay awake in case his daughter finally came." Sophia completely fell apart. By the time we entered the room, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. Daniel looked impossibly small in that hospital bed. Machines surrounded him. Oxygen tubes covered half his face. Yet the moment he saw Sophia, he smiled. "You came," he whispered. Sophia grabbed his hand and collapsed beside the bed. For nearly an hour they talked. Years of anger, blame, and regret finally surfaced. Sophia apologized for believing he had abandoned her. Daniel apologized for not fighting harder to reach her. Neither of them tried pretending 8 lost years could somehow be recovered. They simply stopped wasting the time they still had. Shortly before dawn, Emma quietly entered the room carrying a folded piece of paper. She handed Daniel a drawing of the 4 of us standing together outside my garage. Across the top she had written, "Families can be fixed too." Daniel stared at it for a long time. "Your mother would have loved this," he whispered. Less than 20 minutes later, with Sophia holding one hand and Emma holding the other, Daniel Hart took his final breath. After the nurses left us alone, Sophia discovered a sealed envelope resting on Daniel's bedside table. Written across the front in his shaky handwriting were 4 simple words. "For Sophia, when I'm gone." We buried Daniel Hart 3 days later. More than 2,000 people attended. Politicians came, business leaders came, television crews lined the cemetery entrance. Yet the only thing I remember from that day is Sophia standing alone beside her father's grave long after everyone else had left, holding the envelope he had left for her in both hands, like she was afraid opening it might somehow make his death permanent. She finally read it that evening at the Hart estate. Emma and I were there because Sophia had asked us not to leave her alone. The letter was nearly 20 pages long. About halfway through reading, Sophia suddenly stopped. Tears streamed silently down her face as she handed the pages to me. The section Daniel had marked for me was short. "Jake, years ago, Claire made me promise something on the worst day of her life. She was terrified that Emma would grow up the way Sophia did, surrounded by people yet completely alone. She asked me to make sure that never happened. I gave her my word." I had to stop reading for a moment. I could picture Claire saying those exact words. She had worried constantly about Emma during her final months. Apparently, she'd worried enough to ask a billionaire she trusted to step into our lives if she couldn't stay herself. The rest of the letter revealed just how seriously Daniel had taken that promise. For years, he had secretly watched over us. The anonymous donor who paid our mortgage for 3 months after Claire died? Daniel. The scholarship fund that mysteriously covered Emma's private tutoring when she started struggling after losing her mother. Daniel. The customer who had unexpectedly prepaid for major repairs at my garage during our worst financial year. Daniel again. Suddenly, dozens of unexplained moments from the past 4 years made sense. I remembered arguing with Claire's insurance company after her death because several hospital bills had somehow disappeared. Daniel had paid those too. "He never wanted you to know," Sophia said quietly. "He wrote that helping people only mattered if they never felt indebted." By the time we finished the letter, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sophia finally understood something she'd spent 8 years refusing to believe. Her father had never stopped caring for the people he loved. He had simply loved badly, quietly. quietly, and often from a distance. For the first time since I'd met her, Sophia openly cried for the father she had lost twice. The next morning, the first news alert appeared on my phone. Hart Global founder manipulated by mechanic before death, sources claim. Within an hour, every major network was carrying the story. Anonymous insiders alleged that I had isolated Daniel from his family, influenced changes to his estate, and manipulated a dying old man for financial gain. Attached to the reports were leaked photographs of me, Emma, and Sophia leaving the funeral together. Victor Sloan had launched his final attack, and this time he wasn't just coming after me. He was coming after Daniel's memory. Victor Sloan moved faster than any of us expected. Less than 48 hours after Daniel's funeral, Hart Global's board announced an emergency meeting to review both Daniel's estate and Sophia's leadership. By then, the media had already convicted me. Every news channel seemed to be running the same story. Small-town mechanic manipulates dying billionaire. The fact that none of it was true didn't matter. Truth rarely moves as quickly as scandal. What made things worse was that my relationship with the Hart family had become public. Reporters discovered photographs of me and Emma attending private dinners at the Hart estate, hospital visits with Daniel, even pictures of Sophia visiting my garage. Overnight, the narrative changed from financial exploitation to romance. Headlines suggested Sophia and I had secretly influenced Daniel during his final months. Hart Global stock fell nearly 18% in 3 days. Shareholders panicked. Investors demanded answers. By the time Sophia walked into the emergency board meeting, several directors were already openly calling for her removal as CEO. I waited outside the building with Emma, watching news coverage on my phone, knowing none of this would have happened if Daniel had never walked into my life. Sophia finally emerged nearly 4 hours later, looking exhausted. "They're giving me 1 week," she said quietly as we stood beside my truck. "If the scandal isn't contained, they'll remove me." I already knew what needed to happen. "Then this ends now," I said. Sophia immediately shook her head. "No." I told her the board was right about one thing. As long as I remained part of the story, Hart Global would continue bleeding money and her leadership would remain under attack. "You have thousands of employees depending on you," I said. "You can't lose everything because of me." Sophia looked genuinely angry. "I'm not sacrificing people I care about to save my job." It was the first time either of us had openly acknowledged that we had become more than reluctant allies. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emma quietly said, "Mom used to say running away doesn't fix anything." Sophia smiled sadly, but I had already made my decision. Later that night, after Emma went to bed, I began packing. If leaving protected Sophia, then leaving was exactly what I was going to do. I was loading boxes into my truck early the next morning when my phone rang. The call came from Frank Miller, the retired Hart executive who had helped expose Victor's earlier lies. He sounded shaken. "Jake," he said, "I found something." According to Frank, while reviewing old company archives connected to Daniel's estate, he had discovered a hidden digital file buried inside a secure executive server. The file contained an audio recording made by Daniel himself just weeks before his death. Frank paused before adding, "You need to hear this. I think Daniel knew exactly what Victor was doing." The recording was played 3 days later in the middle of a board meeting that was supposed to end Sophia Hart's career. By then, Hart Global's stock had lost billions in value. Reporters had camped outside headquarters around the clock, and I had already packed half my house. Sophia insisted I attend the meeting anyway. "Whatever happens," she told me, "you deserve to hear this." The atmosphere inside the boardroom felt hostile from the moment we walked in. Several directors wouldn't even look at Sophia. Victor Sloan sat at the far end of the table looking completely relaxed, as if the collapse of Daniel Hart's legacy was nothing more than an unfortunate inconvenience. He formally requested an immediate vote to remove Sophia as CEO, citing poor judgment, reputational damage, and outside influence. Before the vote could begin, Frank Miller entered carrying a laptop and a stack of archived files. Victor's expression changed instantly. Frank calmly explained that while reviewing Daniel's estate records, he had discovered a secure audio file personally recorded by Daniel weeks before his death. Victor immediately objected, demanding the recording be excluded, but Sophia ordered it played. Daniel's voice filled the room. He sounded tired but unmistakably clear. If you're listening to this, then Victor Sloan has probably succeeded in doing what he's been trying to do for years. The entire board went silent. Daniel spent nearly 20 minutes documenting everything. He described discovering missing letters, intercepted phone calls, and manipulated schedules. He named employees Victor had pressured into remaining silent. Most devastating of all, Daniel revealed that he had spent years investigating why Sophia had suddenly cut him out of her life. "My daughter never abandoned me," Daniel said in the recording. "She was kept from me." The recording included copies of archived emails, internal memos, and voice messages Daniel had secretly preserved. One message captured Victor explicitly instructing staff to block all personal communication between Daniel and Sophia. Another revealed Victor discussing how emotional isolation made Daniel easier to control. The board members looked physically sick as the evidence accumulated. Then former employees began standing up. One after another, they confirmed Daniel's account. Some admitted they had remained silent out of fear. Others openly apologized to Sophia. Within an hour, Victor's carefully built empire collapsed. Security escorted him from the building, while cameras recorded every second. The reaction outside headquarters was immediate. News channels that had spent weeks attacking me suddenly reversed course. Public outrage shifted entirely toward Victor. Social media exploded. Hart Global's stock began recovering before markets even closed. But none of that mattered much to Sophia. After the board meeting ended, she asked me to walk with her to her father's office. For a long time, she simply stood there looking out over Charleston Harbor. Finally, she said, "My entire life, I thought my father stopped fighting for me." She paused. "He never stopped. I just never saw it." Sitting on Daniel's desk was a final folder Frank had recovered alongside the recording. Inside was a copy of Claire's last letter to Daniel. At the bottom, written in Claire's unmistakable handwriting, was a single request. "If I'm gone, and Jake ever needs family, choose him the way I chose you." Suddenly, everything made sense. The visits, the $19 million check, the promise. Daniel hadn't chosen me because I fixed a car. He had chosen me because Claire had asked him to. Victor Sloan was indicted less than 2 weeks later. The criminal investigation that followed dominated national headlines for months. But for me, the crisis ended the moment reporters finally stopped parking outside my garage. Customers slowly returned. The foreclosure notice sitting in my toolbox suddenly felt manageable again. For the first time in months, life started looking ordinary. And ordinary sounded pretty good. A few days after Victor's arrest, I told Emma we were going back to normal. No more Hart estate. No more board meetings. No more billionaires. Just the two of us, our little house, and the garage. Emma didn't say much at first. She simply nodded and went upstairs. I assumed she understood. I was wrong. Later that night, I found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom surrounded by drawings she'd made over the past several months. Almost every picture included Daniel. Most included Sophia, too. When I told her we would probably be seeing a lot less of Sophia now that everything was over, Emma completely fell apart. "Everybody always leaves," she cried. "Mom left because she got sick. Grandpa Daniel left because he died. Now Sophia's leaving too." I tried explaining that people didn't disappear just because circumstances changed, but even as I said the words, I realized how hollow they sounded. Emma had already experienced more loss in 10 years than many people experience in a lifetime. The following afternoon, Sophia came by the garage to return several boxes of Claire's letters that had remained at the Hart estate. The moment Emma saw her, she wrapped both arms around Sophia and refused to let go. Sophia held her for a long time without saying a word. After Emma finally went inside, Sophia and I stood alone beside the old Mustang that had started this entire mess. "Emma told me you're planning to move on," Sophia said quietly. I nodded. "Your life is here. Mine is at Hart Global. Maybe this is where the story ends." Sophia looked away toward the harbor in the distance. "I've spent most of my life alone, Jake," she said. "After my mother died, I convinced myself that needing people only guaranteed pain." She paused before continuing. "Then my father died, and somehow losing him hurt even more because I'd already lost 8 years before that." Her voice cracked. "I can't lose you and Emma too." Hearing those words scared me more than any scandal ever had. Loving Claire had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Losing her had nearly destroyed me. For years I'd quietly promised myself I would never risk that kind of loss again. Standing there with Sophia, I realized I had been protecting myself by refusing to truly live. Neither of us knew what to say next. Fortunately, Emma did. She walked out of the house carrying one of her drawings and handed it to us. It showed the 4 of us standing together outside my garage. Me, Emma, Sophia, and Daniel watching from a cloud overhead. Across the top she'd written in bright red marker, "Families don't have to start together to become one." Then she looked directly at both of us and said, "I think Grandpa Daniel already picked us. We're just taking a really long time to notice." Neither Sophia nor I had an answer for that because deep down, we both knew she was right. I made my decision 2 weeks later. Not because of Daniel's money, not because of Hart Global, and definitely not because Emma kept strategically leaving family drawings on my kitchen table every morning. I chose to stay because, for the first time since Claire died, leaving felt more painful than staying. I still remember standing in my garage before opening that morning, staring at the old foreclosure notice I'd kept folded inside my toolbox for nearly a year. The bank had agreed to restructure my debt after the scandal ended and business slowly returned, but the paper remained there anyway. It reminded me of who I had been, a man surviving one day at a time, convinced survival was enough. Sophia arrived just after sunrise carrying coffee and a folder. "I need your opinion," she said. The folder contained plans for a complete restructuring of Hart Global. Entire divisions were being reorganized. Executive bonuses were being capped. Millions of dollars would be redirected toward employee hardship programs, family medical support, grief counseling, and community health care initiatives. At the center of everything was a new charitable foundation named after Claire and Daniel. "My father spent years helping people quietly," Sophia said. "I think the company should do the same." Looking through those pages, I realized something important. Sophia wasn't trying to become the woman her father had been. She was becoming the woman he had always hoped she could be. The changes transformed more than Hart Global. They transformed us. Emma stopped asking whether people she loved were going to leave. She started sleeping through the night again. The nightmares she'd carried since Claire's death gradually disappeared. Sophia became a permanent part of our daily life so naturally that neither Emma nor I could identify exactly when it happened. One evening, while we were making dinner together, Emma casually referred to the Hart estate as home, then looked embarrassed. Sophia immediately knelt beside her and said, "You never have to apologize for feeling safe somewhere." Watching the two of them together healed parts of me I hadn't realized were still broken. Claire's death had taught me that love could disappear without warning. Over time, I'd quietly mistaken grief for loyalty. Somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that loving someone new meant leaving Claire behind. It wasn't until Sophia found me sitting alone in the garage one night that I finally admitted the truth. "I'm terrified," I told her, "because losing Claire almost destroyed me." Sophia took my hand and said, "I'm terrified too. But losing people hurts whether you love them or not. At least this way, we get the time. A month later, Emma solved the problem neither of us seemed capable of solving ourselves. During a family dinner at the Hart estate, she placed 2 folded pieces of paper in front of us. Mine simply read, "Are you going to stop pretending now?" Sophia's said exactly the same thing. We both laughed for the first time in days. That night, standing on the estate's back porch overlooking Charleston Harbor, Sophia and I finally stopped hiding from what had already become obvious. We chose each other openly, freely, and without conditions. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, just 2 people who had spent years living inside different kinds of loneliness, deciding they didn't want to do it anymore. Months later, while sorting through some of Daniel's remaining papers, Sophia discovered one final note addressed to Claire. It contained only a single sentence. "I give you my word. Emma will never be alone." Looking around at the family that had somehow formed out of grief, loss, and second chances, we realized Daniel Hart had kept his promise after all. 5 years later, I still keep the original $199 invoice in my toolbox. The paper is faded now. The ink has started disappearing around the edges. Most people would have thrown it away years ago. Sophia keeps telling me to frame it. Emma thinks we should donate it to the Claire Carter Foundation Museum. But every morning, before I start work at the garage, I open that old red toolbox and look at it for a few seconds. It reminds me that entire lives can change over something small enough to fit on a single sheet of paper. Back then, I thought I was fighting to save my business. I had no idea I was about to gain a family. The garage survived. In fact, it thrived. We expanded twice over the following years, hired 6 additional mechanics, and eventually became one of the most respected restoration shops in South Carolina. But business success turned out to be the least important thing that happened to us. The real transformation came through the Claire Carter Foundation. Sophia launched it less than 6 months after Daniel's death. What started as a small children's oncology charity quickly grew into something much larger. Today, the foundation funds pediatric cancer programs, grief counseling, family housing near hospitals, and emergency financial support for parents who suddenly find themselves choosing between medical treatment and paying rent. Every year, thousands of families receive help. Every year, somewhere in America, a frightened parent hears the words, "Don't worry, the foundation will cover it." And every time that happens, Claire's kindness continues a little longer. Emma is 15 now, and if you ask me, she turned into exactly the person Claire always hoped she would become. She volunteers at Charleston Children's Hospital every Thursday afternoon, just like her mother once did. The nurses there absolutely adore her. Sometimes when I visit the hospital and see Emma sitting beside a frightened child explaining why hospital food should probably be illegal, I have to look away for a moment. Because for just a second, I see Claire again. Emma still carries her mother's compassion, but she also inherited something from Daniel Hart. The stubborn belief that nobody should suffer alone if there's anything you can do about it. Sophia says Emma somehow managed to inherit the best parts of all 3 of us while avoiding most of our flaws. I think she's probably right. As for Sophia, she transformed Hart Global in ways nobody thought possible. Under her leadership, employee family support programs became company policy. Executive bonuses were tied partly to community impact. Profits still mattered, but it no longer mattered more than people. Every year on the anniversary of Daniel's death, Sophia disappears into Daniel's old study for exactly 30 minutes. She still listens to his final voicemail. She never lets anyone join her. When she comes out, she always looks emotional, but peaceful too. Once, I asked what he said. Sophia smiled and answered, "Mostly that he loved me. I spent 8 years believing I didn't need to hear those words. Turns out I spent 8 years needing them more than anything." People still occasionally ask about the $19 million. Journalists especially love that part of the story. They usually expect some dramatic answer about inheritance, wealth, or justice. The truth disappoints them. Most of that money eventually went into the foundation because that's what Claire would have wanted. The rest secured Emma's future and allowed me to keep my garage without fear. But years later, I understand something I couldn't see back then. The money was never the inheritance. Daniel Hart's real gift wasn't financial, it was relational. He gave Sophia back her father. He gave Emma the family Claire had desperately wanted for her. And somehow, he gave a stubborn widower permission to love again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, all three of us sit on the back porch of the Hart estate watching the sun disappear over Charleston Harbor. Emma talks about college. Sophia complains about board meetings. I usually listen. Above the fireplace inside the house hangs the final drawing Emma gave Daniel in the hospital. Families can be fixed too. She was right. Daniel's promise still lives inside all of us. And after everything that happened, I've finally come to understand something Daniel himself figured out long before I did. Some debts are simply too large to repay with money. They can only be repaid with love.